In this video, we are going to cover state management using sessions. The first point is, when we already have cookies, what is the need for session? We have already done certain things with cookies. Where exactly is the need now for session state management? Cookies have some problems. Few which I have already referred to before. Browsers limit the total number of cookies and the size of each cookie. And in cookie we can store only strings. The value of the cookie is supposed to be string. There are situations where I don't want to store string from carrying from one page to another page. I may want to store some other data. So there cookies become a limitation. Second, cookies are traveling over the network from server to client and client to server. So there is the possibility of somebody hacking the data which is traveling and then analyzing the packets to make out what we are transferring from client to server, server to client in the form of cookies. So hence cookies are not safe unless the developer on the server has taken all the precaution to encrypt the data and submit over the network to the client. And again when it gets back, decrypt and then use it. But otherwise, yes, they are not safe. So we have now got HTTP session state. That is a state management technique where the data will not be traveling on the network between client and server. Will have data saved on the server itself. So how does it all work? Let us see. If at all we have got multiple clients, let's say client 1, client 2, which is actually different browsers. If it is same machine, different browser instances can be treated as different clients. So when a client is going to submit a request to the server, ASP.NET will take the request and will execute the pages on behalf of that client. So let's say solid lines are for one client and dashed lines are for another client. So it is going to happen now like this, that for every client we will have one session object created on the server. And when the page is executing on behalf of that client, the data will be stored in the corresponding session object. And the data will be retrieved also from the corresponding session object. So let us say if this client 1 has submitted the request for page 1. In page 1, I would add a key value pair to this session. And when the same client later submits a request for page 2, this page 2 can retrieve that key value pair from the same session object. Likewise, client 2 will have its own session object, and same page 1 will write data to the second session object rather than to the first session object. In short, every client will have its own session object on the server, and this session object is going to manage the key value pairs on behalf of that client so that these key value pairs can be shared across pages when requested by that particular client. So it's a state management technique where the data is saved on server itself, not on the client. Cookies will be saved here, whereas session data is saved here, not on the client. So now there are certain questions which arises. One is, if for this particular client this session has to be used, how should ASP.NET know that the request has come from so and so client only? In other words, how is ASP.NET able to map the client to the corresponding session object on the server? Because HTTP protocol is stateless, then this question arises. We have got all the requests going from the client, first hitting the server, IIS then giving it to ASP.NET, ASP.NET using the appropriate session. So how does ASP.NET know that the request has come from client 1 or the request has come from client 2? That remains one question. And the second question which has to be asked is, what is the lifetime of this session object on the server? How much time is this data going to be there on the server? Because the more number of session objects are created on server is going to cause more load. So we can't keep these session objects permanently on server. So how are they destroyed? What is the criteria for destroying these session objects which is created on behalf of different clients? Now the answer to these questions is, when the request comes from the client for the first time, at that time a new session object will be created on server, and a unique ID is assigned to that session object, and the same ID in the form of cookie will be rendered to the client, and that is going to be saved as a non-persistent cookie on the client browser instance. Therefore, the subsequent request the client makes, that session ID cookie is going to be included in the request, and on server ASP.NET is going to use that session ID cookie to identify the corresponding session object on server. So the unique ID which is given to the session when it is created for a given client will be rendered to the browser in the form of a cookie, that is session ID, and the same cookie is used to identify that client and associate the appropriate session object on server. And if that cookie is not there in the request, it is automatically going to create a new session for that client, and a new session ID will be rendered to that client. So this is how ASP.NET identifies the appropriate session object for every request. And the second point is about how long is the session going to exist. For every session, there is a timeout period defined. We can change that or we can set that, but the default timeout period is 20 minutes. That means once a request comes from the client, for next 20 minutes, that client's session on the server is valid. And within next 20 minutes, if a request does not come, the session object on the server will be destroyed. But at the same time, if within 20 minutes from a client a request comes, the session timeout is further extended from that time to next 20 minutes. So this is called as sliding expiration. The expiration will keep sliding every time a request comes from the client and hits the server. So when is the session destroyed on server? When there is no activity of the client on the server, the session object is destroyed. There should be an activity, then only the sessions keep extending with a timeout period. Now, there is a question here. I open the browser, submit a request, a session is created on the server, and I immediately close the browser on the client. Is the session on the server destroyed? No, the server is still going to manage the session for next 20 minutes because server does not know that the browser has been closed. There is no facility in HTTP protocol where when the browser is closing, it will tell server I am closing and server please destroy my session object. Something like that doesn't happen. So a session when created on the server is sure to last for the timeout period if there is no request coming from the client. Even if the client has been already closed, the browser instance has been already closed, the session on the server is going to stay. So this is how session tracking is done, session management is done for managing data. Let us see programmatically how do we use this feature. I am creating a new website. Session state demo app. Let us put a label here. LBL counter. Now I said session is supposed to contain key value pair. When the request comes from the client, I am checking in the session, is there a key with CNT existing? If it is not existing, then I'll initialize a variable to 0. But if the session is existing, or else in either case no, I want to do something little different. Session is not existing. In session of CNT, let us put 0. And then in either case, let us increment this session of CNT. But you see, session of CNT, we can either give index or we can give name and value. Value is of type object. So in such case, I do unboxing and add 1 to it. The result is going to be boxed into the same session variable again. And whatever is the last value of this session variable, I would like to show that in the label. Let's run this. Now refresh this page, press F5. Every time you refresh, it's incrementing. Why? When the first request was submitted by this client, a session object was created. In that session object, a key value pair count is equal to 1 was added, and in response the ID of that session has come to the browser. So here now in the browser we have got ID of that particular session. Now when I say refresh, again the request is submitted for this page. Along with the request, now the ID is automatically going to be included, and that ID is going to be used on server for identifying the corresponding session object to take the value of count from there, increment by 1 and render it to the browser. So every time it takes the value, it increments, renders it to the browser, and that's how. Keep pressing F5 and it keeps incrementing it. Now I copy the same URL into another browser instance. I've started a new browser instance here. So now if I say go, we'll see value again here is 1. Why? Because this browser instance cookie is not shared with this browser instance, as it is a non-persistent cookie. So there is a different session object created for this browser on server, and the session object for this is completely different. So there are two different browser instances. But let's copy this URL, open a new tab and paste it here. You'll find that this tab is using the same session as this tab on server. Go here now, refresh. So both the tabs are using the same session. Why? Because both of them are into same browser instance. And same thing happens even if using JavaScript we open a new pop-up window from this browser. Even that pop-up window is going to use the same session object on server. So one browser instance, remember, can have multiple tabs or multiple windows. All these windows and the multiple tabs are going to use one common session object on server, because all these are using a single value of session ID, as it is all one instance of the browser. So this is how session tracking is done. So easy. I mean, the syntax is so easy. You have to simply write session of variable is equal to value. Now we can also do that login problem what we did with cookies with the sessions now. So let us say I want to make default.aspx as a secured page. How to do that? Right click, add new item, call it as login.aspx, and here I have to design the login form. So I have got now username, password, label and login, submit, click. Submit. Now what will I do here? Txt username dot text, password is equal to txt password dot text. Then verify if username and password is valid or invalid. If I say username and password are same, then we will treat that as valid, otherwise invalid. So if valid, what shall we do? In session of username, the key, I'll put the current username and I'll redirect the user to default page / default.aspx. Else in the label I'll simply show the error message, invalid username or password. So now if a username and password is valid, we are putting the username in session and redirecting. If not, we are showing this. So how does in other pages I know that the user has already logged in? I'll check for this. If this is not equal to null, then it implies that the user has logged in. Otherwise, the user has not logged in. So now go to, let us say, default.aspx.cs file. And the first thing we will do here is check if username is equal to null. Simply write response dot redirect to login.aspx. Run this. Actual request going to default, it got redirected to login page. Give username and password invalid. Now give valid. Say test. We are there. Now you can refresh. So whatever we have done with cookies, you can also do that same thing with sessions. The difference is cookies are going to store data on client, whereas sessions are going to store data on server. Cookies will have only values which are of type string. Sessions can have any kind of data stored in them. But it is always recommended that we avoid using sessions for large volume of data, because that would then add overhead to the server's memory and that can degrade the performance of the application. Now let us see this few important things here. This notes is all about how session tracking is done, the cookies come. Now programmatically a session can be destroyed. Through code we can destroy a session. Something like when a user is logging out, I can say session.abandon. That will destroy the session object on the server, and in the subsequent request a new session will be created. Now important point to remember is about session. Suppose I am doing this, and here after putting data in the session, if I say session.abandon, and if I say that session.abandon is going to destroy the session immediately, we should get here null, and null.toString should give us exception. But does it happen? Let us see. I give some username, password, login, and yes, it's destroying it. Why session? Okay, sorry, it's not giving exception. No, I have to explain it in a little different way. I don't want this. This is causing some confusion. Let us remove for a while. Now run again. I'll get 1. If I refresh, I'll again get 1, no doubt. But point is, we are not getting error. Otherwise, we are supposed to get error here, because once I say session.abandon, session would be destroyed. No, actually session.abandon does not destroy the session immediately. Session would be there and will be valid till this request lifetime. And when the response is rendered to the browser, then the session on the server will be destroyed. And that's how next time when it comes, again it will find count as null, 0, 1. Again mark the session for destroying, but 1 is assigned to the label. We don't get exception. So similarly now let us remove abandon and instead use session.remove all. Remove all is going to remove the key value pair. We'll get an error now. Why? Simple. The reason is here. When I say remove all, from the session, CNT is removed, but the session is still valid. Only the key CNT is removed from the session. And session of CNT would become null and this will become error. So, you have to be cautious. What do you want to use? Session.abandon or session.remove all? Session.abandon destroys the session but only after the current page response is rendered to the browser. Session.remove or session.remove all will immediately remove the key value pairs from the session object, but they will not destroy the session. Same session object is going to be used by the client for subsequent request. Then few more important things about session. Let us look at. In some cases, we will not use session in a web page. Then why should I do some session initialization? There is a possibility that in a web application we would have few pages where I am not using a session variable. In those kind of situations, why should framework execute the additional code of session initialization? We can tell ASP.NET Framework not to do session initialization for those types of pages and directly simply execute the page, because for session property of the page to be initialized, it takes some extra code that I want to skip now when I know that in that page I'm not going to use a session. And how that can be done? Simply put in the page directive enable session state is equal to false. So this improves the performance of that page. So default value is true. You can give false. In certain cases, you might be using session, but you might be only reading data out of session. You will not be changing data. In such case, you can give read only. So enable session state for a page directive can be either read only or false or true. Then how to know programmatically whether the session is read only or not? Yes, you can use is read only property to check if the session is marked as read only using enable session state or not. We have similarly a property is new session. When is this property true? When the request has come for the first time from the client, there is no session ID and a new session is created for that client. At that time, is new session will be true. So when a request is new, a new session is created, I may want to write some additional code for initialization of some data into session, probably some user settings we would like to retrieve from database and store in session if it is a new session. Like that, you can set programmatically the session timeout. Default is 20 minutes, of course. You can change it to 30 minutes. Then we can configure a session in web.config. So you can go to web.config and here give session state. You can give timeout, say 30. So for all the clients now, the session timeout is 30 minutes. Similarly, now there are cases where sessions we want to work even if a cookie is disabled on the client. How will you do that? You have to say cookieless is equal to use URI or cookieless is equal to true. Both are same. So how does this work? Now run. You'll see now the URL is changing. Let me first rectify that. Now I submit the request for default.aspx, but you see the session has changed. Session ID got added here. So refresh now. Now suppose, that is a key actually. Suppose I do not have this session ID, and if I submit the request, hit enter, what's happening? We got one now. So whenever a request comes from the client in the form of URL without session ID, a new session is going to be created on server, and in the response, no, a new session is going to be created. Now here in the page output, you have to ensure that all the URLs which you are mentioning are relative path. You should then not give absolute path starting from this, because if you are giving absolute path starting from http colon and so, then again you may not be knowing this, and that would cause problem, because from there onwards it would become a new session. So when you are using cookieless sessions, please ensure that the URLs are given always as relative, and by chance you don't want to give as relative path and you want to give absolute path, in such cases you can actually do this. Suppose you are framing the absolute path like this: http colon / request.url.host colon the port number. Then you are supposed to give the application path, but this application path you pass to another function called as apply app path modifier. So actually here, what is the application path? This is the application path. When this is passed to apply app path modifier, that's going to return all this string including the session ID. So this way you can frame a relative path if required. But then cookieless sessions have a problem. Now refresh this. Refresh this page. I got 15. Copy this into a new browser instance. 16. Actually, there are two different browser instances. Even if they are running on two different machines, they both will end up using the same session on server, because explicitly we are putting the session ID here. So if somebody knows the session ID, they can simply use this URL and continue the same session on server. So in case you don't want to allow this kind of facility, do not enable cookieless session. Next, what is web garden and what is web farming? See, there are certain websites which are very large, like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Rediff. These kind of websites cannot run on just one web server. They would need cluster of web servers. So in these kind of situations, our one single web application, there is a possibility that is being served by different IaaS instances. Now these different IaaS instances, web server instances, would be either running on one machine or would be running on different machines. They would be running on one machine to exploit the multiprocessor support which our hardware would have, which our machine would have, and different machines obviously to divide the load between different servers. So one single web application is spreading across different web server instances running on one machine. Then it is called as web garden. And then we know many gardens make a farm. That means if one single web application is spanning over multiple web server instances running on different machines, then it is referred as web farm. So we have web garden and web form in very lot of situations. Now what is the issue with it? The issue is right now the session data is stored in the web server instance. So if at all, if there is a web garden and web form, there is a possibility that from a client, when the request comes, different web server instances are executing the pages on behalf of that client. So if the data is shared in session when requested by by client, and if executed by web server instance 1, and if that page writes something to the session, when same client submits a request for page 2, and if the page 2 is executed by second web server instance, it would not get the data which the previous web server instance executed page has added to session, because both are different server instances, both will have different sessions. This is a serious problem, at least in session management. So how is this problem resolved? What we do is, instead of managing the session by web server instance, we'll manage the session through a separate service. We call that as ASP.NET State Service. So see now, I'll go to I'll go to application in web.config. I'll give mode state server. Now close the browser, run afresh. What is the problem? Unable to make the session state request because ASP.NET State Service is not running. So what to do now? Now go to control panel, administrative tools, services, and here we have to start ASP.NET State Service. Right click, start. So ASP.NET State Service has now started. Now go back to browser, refresh the page. The data is going to be saved in ASP.NET State Service. So it's working. Output will not be different for the client. But what is the benefit now? Instead of storing data in the process of the web server, it has gone into a separate process which should be running on the same machine if it is web garden, and which can be running on a completely different machine if it is a web form, so that the same session data can be shared by all the web server instances which are executing this page or pages of that web application. So you can again stop this rather. Come here, refresh, you'll get an error. So state management can be done through an ASP.NET State Service which is running on a same machine or different machine. And what are the programming efforts? Zero. Only thing you have to do is set here mode to state server. Like that, if you want, you can change the mode and give it as SQL Server also. In such case, you'll have to configure your SQL Server before you manage state with it. And for this, I would prefer you looking at the documentation on how to configure SQL Server for ASP.NET State Management. But the advantage of SQL Server is it's the most reliable one. Even if the SQL Server database crashes, it can be recovered and the sessions can be regained. But if the ASP.NET State Service crashes, all the session data is going to be lost. So that is the advantage of SQL Server State Management. But yes, most commonly used is in proc. In situations where we don't have web garden and web form, there is absolutely no problem and it gives better performance. In case we have web garden and web form, we don't have choice, but we have to use either state server or SQL Server. And state connection string, in case state server is ASP.NET State Service is running on a different machine, We have to give the IP address or name of that machine here. And similarly, you can give SQL Server connection string in case SQL Server is running on a different machine, with including, of course, username and password for connecting to SQL Server. So this is how ASP.NET State Management can be done using sessions. It's a small topic. Actually, if you are able to do the problem of cookies, it is more than sufficient. Rest of the topics are more important from interview point of view. From the interview point of view, you should be a little careful about all these things. Practically, how much we are going to use this depends on your project size. But yes, so easy. Session of key, and we have the value. Now we have one more last state management technique, that is HTTP application state. Let us see how does this work. I'll copy this. In the same page where I have default.aspx, I'll add one more label. This is for session. I'll have another for application. This is, let us say, session counter. This can be application counter. Go to code view. First, I'll change this to session counter, application counter. So same logic, same code. Lock unlock is extra. Let me remove this for a while, but otherwise same code. Build it. Now run. We'll get 1 1. Refresh. 2 2 3 3 4 4 5 5. Now copy this URL into a new browser instance. Enter. Here it gives 5 6. Sorry, 1 6. Refresh, 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 refresh. Now go back. It will become 6, but this will become 11. So every browser instance has got its own session, but the application key value pairs are being shared between different browser instances. So in case you want some global data to be shared across web forms requested by that application, then you should go, requested by the clients of that application, then you should go for application variable, and it is of type HTTP application state. Because it is shared by multiple clients, we are supposed to write here application.lock, and here we are supposed to give application.unlock. Lock, unlock. Lock would not allow two clients to simultaneously modify the application variable. That's the advantage of lock and lock. So once application lock is executed by one client, another client will not be able to modify the session variable at the same time unless this client has released the lock. This is actually useful in heavy traffic websites. Just refresh. So there's one more, but are we going to use this? We have started state management technique with static variables. I would prefer using those static variables in a class which is an app code folder rather than using application variables, because here application variables, the key is of type string and value is of type object. That means we can put any kind of object, and every time we have to do casting like here we have done to extract the data. But if you have a static variable in an app code folder, for that static variable we can give a data type and that type of data only we can store in it, and that becomes type safe. So prefer always using static variables rather than using application variable, but it is still there because it was there in ASP. They are still supporting it in ASP.NET. That's all about state management. We have covered all the state management techniques which I have initially showed to you in the agenda. So a long topic and very important topic. Please look at least couple of times all these videos and practice every example which is given in the course material, the handout, and whatever walkthroughs we have done here. I would request you to redo them on your own, preferably without looking at the video at that time. Thank you.